Okay, everyone, we'll get started on the afternoon sessions for the Conference on Texas. Again, I'm Heather Russo, Chief of Advancement for the Witte Museum. It is my great privilege to introduce this panel, Future of the Earth, Climate-Ready Buildings. When Maurice McDermott, the Witte's president and CEO, was introduced to the groundbreaking environmental efforts that our speaker, Stephen Hennigen, CEO of Credit Human, is undertaking, she knew that we had to have him speak first to set the scene for the rest of the conference. Stephen is the inspirational leader responsible for the new Credit Human building down on Broadway. It's beautiful. That is operating on renewable sources of power. You'll hear more about his philosophy regarding the future of the Earth as impacted by business models, the story of his astonishing net zero home in a suburban neighborhood is equally compelling, serving as a model for citizens in all of our neighborhoods. Today, Stephen is joined by James Gizzard and Don McDonald. James is the president and co-owner of Harvest Rain, a company specializing in design and builds rainwater collection systems for potable use, irrigation, emergency backup, and fire protection. He has over 15 years of experience installing and designing water conservation systems and has received state and national awards for rainwater system design. He also has a claim to fame. His mother is Maurice McDermott, but she wouldn't want you to know all of that. He's famous on his own right. Donald is an architect of Don A. McDonald Architects, well known across the Southwest and beyond. He's a design architect on the Credit Human and Oxbow building. The Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, Texas chapter, recently awarded the Broadway development a prestigious 2021 John Staub Award. The limestone structure known as the Spring House, we're going to hear all about all this, was recently awarded a Palladio Award by Traditional Building Magazine. He's a real deal here, and hopefully will inspire some of us in what we are working on in our own homes and corporations. So I hand it over to the two of them.
Thank you, Heather. Before we start the sort of informal discussion about Steve's personal house, I think we do have a video that sort of highlights some of the technologies on Steve's home. So if we can roll that video, and we'll sort of ask questions about it as it rolls in the background.
This house, literally, is all we're doing is capturing the rain, the sun, and the Earth's temperatures to create a quality of life. Pretty basic. Step back and say, is it better for us to take on and just build new houses? Or do we have a lot of really good neighborhoods that it's worthy of us to retrofit those houses for energy efficient homes? You have to imagine what are the inputs that are available on your lot. The beauty of this canvas is that it had so much potential because of the possibilities for what we could do with solar energy and rainwater storage and with geothermal energy in the well systems underneath it. The more you can reduce energy demand leads to a smaller amount of energy supply equipment that has to be installed.
So that's a brief overview of all the technologies sort of involved in Steve's personal house, and I had the great privilege of working with Steve to help design the Rainwater Collection system. And Steve, I just wanted to ask you a question to sort of put this in perspective, how big of an undertaking this was. Before you started this path, was there a particular technology or example of technology that inspired you, or was it just generally that you wanted a sustainable modeled home?
Well, the little background on me is that I actually was a CPS Energy trustee for about 10 years from 2001 to 2011. And then during that era, we were really having to heavily contemplate, which has now become the STEP program in San Antonio, but we had to really heavily contemplate how we were going to make a sustainable transition of our energy sector for this region. And so, once my term on the board had ended, obviously you just don't unthink the things that, that genie's out of the bottle. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about that in our own personal home. And it was at this point in time my wife was ready to make a change for a really small reason, but then to say, okay, well, this is a huge opportunity for us to take on something quite profound. The house actually started out from an energy efficiency perspective, but actually, as James will tell you from his experience with working with me, the water became actually one of the largest projects along with the geothermal energy that's put in the project. The house has about 90,000 gallons of above-ground storage. So I want you to think about what 90,000 gallons of above-ground storage looks like in a residential neighborhood with a homeowners association. I just want you to think about that. It's 7 swimming pools above ground. And you have to make it look aesthetically right because, at the end of the day, if you can't put beauty to the natural things you're trying to get into, you're going to lose a lot of people. So the inspiration really started with what was possible, and the term I like to use is what's theoretically possible. So the lot had, it's about nearly a 1 acre lot in the city of San Antonio, but it was part of the watershed of a 3 acre drainage site. So it was basically up on the side of a hill. And so when you start thinking about the potential for that, from a harvesting perspective, whether it be solar harvesting, geothermal harvesting, or simply rainwater harvesting, the potential gets quite large. And so my yard actually drains about 7 acre feet of water through it. And so imagine what you can do with 7 acre feet of water on a lot for a family of 4. And that really became the impetus for a lot of the thinking. Obviously, James' vision helped me push a little bit further and further and further until the fact that we actually are capturing 2 types of rain on the lot. We capture all the rainwater off the roof, and that water is all used for domestic in-house purposes. Yes, we drink the water. Yes, we shower with the water, everything. And then the second water system is the stormwater runoff, which is really the watershed producing all that 7 acre water that's coming down. And so that was really creativity had to come in, is how we're going to actually cascade the tanks to use gravity to do most of the heavy lifting. Then also, how do you position the solar arrays such that the solar arrays are able to shade the tanks as well? We had to actually work through a lot of the challenges of the Unified Development Code here. One of them being, for example, accessory structures. You can't have more accessory structures with a roof on top of it because of the very fact that you're trying to not let the rainwater go down, but the accessory structures on my property were capturing the rainwater. So this is a situation where the code actually was juxtaposed to what we were trying to do. We had to work through a lot of those things. So there was just a lot of things that we had to work through ongoing, but the vision was there. The biggest thing that I would tell you that both on the house and the building, it's assembling a great team. And when you get the right team together, the vision can really run. And so you were a part of that. You got to see what was possible with that. And I would just say that was just the impetus for it.
Excellent. So I appreciate the kind words. I will say that Steve was extremely involved with the process, both from the design perspective, the coordination perspective. And I want to touch on something that you just said, which is, what did you learn about the overall appetite for bringing this type of technology to fruition on a residential home? Would it be regulatory or social acceptance? Was there a learning curve there?
Well, we probably underestimated the emotional reaction to a project like this in the inner city initially. I would say today, if someone were to do a project like this, it would be far easier. This project my home was actually done in 2015, so things weren't as acute back then as they are today with water and particularly with energy. And my general comment would be is that it's really interesting when you get behind a gate in a community, and this is probably the big learning from my family, is that the gated communities tend to have a different reaction than the ungated communities. And I'll just kind of leave it at that. You can let your own mind go a little bit on that. But at the end of the day, I would say that the neighbors were probably 50-50 split. And, some absolutely loved it and supported it, and another group absolutely hated it. So I think the adoption rate is coming with time. If you were to see the property today and it's full view, you can't see any of that infrastructure from the road at all. And we were told early on, hire a really great landscape architect to help with that, which we did. And it's truly proven to be a beautiful project.
So having witnessed the design process and then the actual technologies going in place, knowing how personally involved you are with numbers and statistics, how is it performing? What would you say your overall performance is from your personal home?
So the house, just to give you a perspective, you didn't get to see the entire video. The house actually, for any of those that knows what a HERS score is, it's the home energy rating score that is typically used to set the standard by which how energy efficient houses. A 0 being completely net zero and a 100 being a standard house built in the year 2006 for the geographical equivalent. This house scores a negative 83. Negative 83. And so what that basically means is that my house has an output of carbon equivalent to 1 full house. So that we produce more oxygen than we do carbon to the extent that we actually support another house. And then the elements that I'll get us there are interesting to do with. So, for example, there's no fossil fuels being burned in the interior anymore because we're running everything on geothermal. Geothermal, it does all the domestic hot water heating, it does all the cooling and heating for the house, it heats the pool spas, things of that nature. So when you move to a geothermal heat sink, which is where the persistent energy below the ground is 72 degrees, what can you do with that temperature to harvest it? And it's just an amazing process. And so those are the types of technology that allow us to say how it goes. So for example, when it was 28 degrees outside just 2 years ago for 3 days, I think my heater got in second gear once, which means it never really ran over the low speed, which tells you how efficient the house is. Now, you have to look at also the house has an energy insulation package on it that is amazing. And so the first thing we had to get right was the insulation side of the house. And we actually went after the demand side first before we put the supply side on it, and that was a lot of the elements. So from a performance perspective, the house basically provides all its own electricity through the peaks and the troughs. It's actually wired for 4 electric cars, so we have excess energy we're producing there. It has a negative carbon footprint. We drink all the domestic water. We've never had to use any SAWS water inside the house. And what that basically means, there's no salts, there's no chemicals. None of that stuff is in my home anymore. We don't have to worry about any type of calcium residuals on our pipes, things of that nature. From the rainwater perspective, the taste of the water is amazing. If you have it tested, which we have it tested periodically, it's 99% more pure than SAWS water. So those are all the benefits that come from this type of investment. And so I would just say the only thing that James and I probably missed in the calculations we did is that we actually underestimate the performance of the roof. So the roof actually has performed better. It's a 5,000 square foot roof for a family of 4. So now we only need 14 inches of rainfall in a year to actually sustain our family. And then we misestimated the stormwater runoff because of the saturation level of the ground swells before it would come down. So I'm having to use a little bit more water in the yard, but a far lot less water on the house. And so that was probably the only thing that was probably the surprises that we had. But overall, the house is an extremely comfortable home. It's not this weird thing that you would think it would be. All the materials that are in it are basic to what you would have in your home, and it's just a really comfortable house to live in.
So I'll ask one more question as a transition to the Credit Human building, which Don will ask you about. And that building was certainly more complex, and Don will ask questions about that. But were there any insights gained from building your personal home that you could transition and use in the process of designing and building the Credit Human building?
Well, I would say pretty much everything in my house is what led into the building design that Don was a big part of, as far as everything that's in my house is in the building. The super efficient building envelope, the glazing effects. Yes, there's a geothermal system at the building down the street. You'll hear Don talk about that. We're capturing all the rainwater, 80% of the surfaces, and we have a 1 megawatt power supply on that building. So I would say everything that was applicable to the house actually showed up in some form down at the building. Now, in some regards, the building performs better than the house, and in other regards, my house outperforms the building. So it's just basically a difference between land, because the building is on a 3-acre site, my house is on a 1-acre site. The building has 800 occupants in it, my house has 4 occupants in it. So you can just begin to see some of the differences from that alone.
Sort of the law of numbers, larger,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you for telling us about your personal house. Don, I'll turn it over to you to talk about Credit Human building.
Thanks. I believe there's a video on this as well.
Everyone says this is going to be the greenest building in Texas, and they're right. It's going to be one of the greenest buildings in the United States.
Credit Human has gone beyond just energy efficiency, conservation, site materials, indoor air quality. They've done all of those things and beyond, and moved into energy and water security. The Credit Human building is the building of the future.
Well, there are many innovative buildings like this, honestly, anywhere. So this really stands out for San Antonio to have a significant company like Credit Human decide to take these major steps and be an example.
As we see more of these developments happen, hopefully there'll be new businesses, new jobs, new employment, new skills that happen here in San Antonio. And I think for me personally, that's what's really exciting about this. We'll start to see a marketplace and an economy within San Antonio that really is moving in this direction. It's a testament to the leadership of Credit Human to make this actually happen, from a design and a vision to a reality.
My hope is that this building, this development, becomes a model for others to follow. From the dirt to the roof, it's an exemplary type of development.
So Steve, I was intrigued with something that you tapped into on your house, and this is the integration of technology with architecture. And that seems to be one of our challenges. And I'm a little too close to this project to really look at it objectively, but I have caught a glimpse of it coming in from Austin a couple of times. And I'm intrigued with this kind of elegant solar array perched on top of this traditional San Antonio building, something that looks and feels like it belongs in San Antonio. And I think that dialogue between this sophisticated technology and the architecture, I mean, we have a 300-year-old architecture in San Antonio, and I think that is one particularly successful thing, and I think it says a lot about how we view things in San Antonio, and I think it builds on a San Antonio vocabulary. I think this sort of ties back into one of these questions, which is, and this is always a challenge, in this day and time, how do we encourage people to tap into it's you know, we've been spoiled with inexpensive construction, cheap energy over the last 50 or 60 years, and now we're asking people to invest in this new technology, and they're not. I don't know if they're seeing a payback yet, you know, or what the payback is, but how do we encourage people? I think part of it is integrating with the architecture to get people to understand that it's palatable, but beyond that, how do we convince people to do this?
Yeah. So let me just start out by saying Don was an integral part of this project. So when you hear that I'm associated with this was really an amazing team with the Silver Venture folks and Don McDonald and his staff to build this project. So this is a real labor of love for all of us. We're very proud of this work. With respect to how the project was divided up, I think it's also important is that we actually took on two fronts when we did this building. We took on the aesthetics themselves. How can we make this building feel like it fits in this community? It's an approachable building. It is part authentic San Antonio, which is what Don is talking about. And then at the same time, how do we actually move this building to the forefront of sustainability and environmental stewardship? And so we've actually married those two concepts together in this project. So a lot of the reason this happened was because of the way we approached the project. Don can speak ad nauseum about how the aesthetics were done, and if you really go up and look at the building, it truly is a masterpiece. It's a handmade building with the artisans that literally can sign their name to the bottom of the canvas on this property. Just the way it was all designed, the brick, the layout, the thoughtfulness, and all the curation of the items in that. And then the test to John's point is how do you then wrap sustainability around that, those features? And one of the items that John raised was the solar array. We actually had a big debate about that solar array, whether it should be on the roof or it should be elevated for people to see. And so if you now notice today, it's actually a visible architectural feature of the design. And in fact, by taking the architectural feature up and making it prominent, we went from about a 400 megawatt system to a 1 megawatt system because of the penthouses and all the things that would have been a barrier to the solar array. So by actually elevating it above all of that, we were actually able to achieve even more sustainable goals, and then we had to actually make it look aesthetically pleasing, and I think that's what you've really pulled off with the design of that. With respect to some of the challenges that I think building owners are having, that Don's raising, is that for far too long that we've had a really short-sighted view on how we build our buildings. And so if you think about when we build our buildings, we would pick materials for the most part that would last long-term. So if you built a building for 50 years, why wouldn't you design every element of that building for 50 years? Why would some elements be the 50-year elements and some people would be the 5-year elements? And so that never made sense to me because at 5 years you're going to be replacing things and you're typically doing because you're trying to cut costs or value engineer the things. And our intention was basically with this building to stay in the building a long time. And I think if people had a little bit more long-term view about that, the cost of the investments become far less if you're having to not think about replacements, of a 5, 10, 15-year value with 50-year items. One other thing that we've been spoiled with, Don, when you raise the price, we talk about the prices of materials been cheap for a long time, the price of money's been cheap for a long time. The price of energy and water have been cheap for a long time. And in a lot of our analysis we did, and I'll give you a statistic you may not be aware of, when we built our initial building out on I-10 at Vance Jackson, back in 1976, the building we just recently vacated, That building cost us about $6 million in capital cost to build, and the annual electric and water bill of that building back then was about $30,000 a year, about $2,500 a month starting in 1976. Fast forward to just last year, the year before COVID, before we vacated the building, the annual electric and utility bill on that 1976 building was almost $500,000 a year. I want you to think about that. $500,000 a year of energy and water consumption. Now, a lot of that's the building decay, the building envelope decay, the glazings, things of that nature, but it's consuming that type of resources. So when you start to put in perspective, a 42-year-old building had a 20x increase in utility cost over that period of time, that puts it in a different view than if you just look at what's the utility rate's going to do for the next 5 to 10 years. And so it was that thinking that actually pushed us to look a lot harder at this building because we want to make it last as long as we can. And yes, they cost a little bit more up front, but in the long run, they're going to far more pay off. Now, to the point, I think one of the things we got to convince people, Don, and this is against your industry a little bit, is that, and I'll use my house as an example, when we finished our house, the cost of the hardwood floors, the countertops, the cabinets, and the tile in our bathrooms cost more than all of the sustainable issues we just described. So it was 4 items in my home, the finishes, that cost more than all of the infrastructure you saw that pushed that house in a sustainable viewpoint. The same with the building is if you look at the investments we made on this building, the total investments were about $12 million on about a $180 million project. The finishes in our building, if you look at them, the interior finishes, they cost about $40 million. So I want you to think about that for a second. So where are we putting our priorities? And then how do we need to shift that priority to not necessarily give up the aesthetics, but also make room in the budget, if you will, for these real long-term, sustainable, and very important and profound issues that are going to have a fundamental payback more than the aesthetics are going to have the payback. So I think that's the challenge, is how do we actually right-size that a little bit. And also I think that if you begin to look at what utility and water prices are going to do over the next 30 to 40 years, is what we have studied, you're going to begin to see water rates, particularly, go up between 5 and 7% per year, and utility rate and electricity rates between 4 and 6% per year. If you compound that out, you'll wind up with the same effect we just left at our old bill. And so some of these investments that we're making, which are several $million, are going to seem actually quite cheap over time because of basically the nature of these changing water and utility rates. So in the end, we actually expect about a 13-year payback on the investments down at the new building. And if you look at last year's utility bill, I'll just give you the numbers for those that don't know or haven't read about it. On a square footage basis, we've reduced the electricity consumption by 91% and the water consumption by 86%. We didn't get to zero, but we got pretty darn close. And so what's that mean in terms of cost? What's that mean in hard cost and in payback? And then what does that also mean in terms of carbon costs and things of that, those elements that we're not necessarily measuring yet that are going to become more and more important to us. And I think that's really where we have to shift the paradigm around about how we possibly look at finishes relative to some of these other items that we can aesthetically make work that I believe are going to be really important. So for example, on our building, you put a lot of masonry in that building, and that masonry is very cost effective. So you blended the architectural features with a lot of the sustainability to make it a more durable building in the long run. So that building should last us 50 to 100 years without much maintenance.
That's a good point. I think that we always look at sustainability within the context of where we're building. In this case, we built in a river bottom where we had clay. We've been using clay for hundreds of years in San Antonio, either adobe or brick. We're across the river from the original limestone quarry. We've been using limestone. Fort Sam Houston is brick and limestone. The Pearl is brick and limestone. So I like to think that we're building a timeless architecture that will endure as well. And I think that ties back into sustainability. If we build something to stand the test of time, I think we're ambitiously thinking this will be a 500-year project. So while the buildings in the neighborhood are torn down every 50 years and rebuilt, we'll have a building that will stand the test of time. And ultimately, that's the best sustainability model. One of the things that I'm always intrigued with on this project, and this gets back to how people like the building, how they engage with the building. And I was surprised, pleasantly surprised on this project. I've never worked with anyone where everyone, every employee was so passionate about what they were doing and so engaged in the project. There was no detail that was too small that we did not get a response on. And I'm intrigued to know how that's played out. Obviously, we've had a pandemic throughout this process, but this was a group of people that came from the suburbs, and they've been moved into the city, and there's a lot more engagement with the city. Has that played out well with the work environment? How does that?
Well,
and how do you relate that to
let me give you the headline.
sustainability?
If you ask every employee, do they want to go back to the old building? They unequivocally no. So that's the first headline. The second thing you guys should all know is that, to Don's point, as part of the interior design process, in addition to the exterior, we were trying to truly trying to transform our culture in many ways that hadn't existed before, from how can we get people to eat more healthy, to eliminate all waste streams, to exercising, to reduction of paper, all of these things. We actually hired an organizational psychologist, and we worked for about 2 years on every little design feature inside the building. So you can imagine you're coming to this new building that's architecturally beautiful, set in an amazing neighborhood setting, is that all these sustainable features now, and on the inside of the building, it's a whole new set of behaviors we're asking people to do. And so I'd say, with the exception of the work at home question, that is a big question now, everyone loves the building. And what's not to love about it? It's just, we have a green wall in there. Just the amount of healthy food that we've introduced in the options, the outdoor terraces that are now available, the technology that allows them to roam anywhere. We actually introduced the workstations. There's no offices in the building, by the way, so it's all open design. The workstations are all now staffed where first-line supervisors are with their teams, but the middle management and senior managers are in a lottery system. We move them randomly throughout the building to build cross-functional relationships, and so they're away from their teams. They're not crowding them anymore. There's no more phones on the desk anymore. It's basically all transformed for them, and so it's kind of like a new playground. They're having to figure out how to use it, and I think it's going to take us a couple more years to do that. The biggest thing I've watched is probably the people are saying that because the way the building's designed, they have to move more. And if you don't know this, there's an 8-story staircase that goes from the 5th floor all the way up to the 12th floor of the building that's designed to take people out of the elevators and get them moving. And it's absolutely gorgeous the way it's been designed for those that haven't seen it. So you can imagine how the people are actually losing weight. They're feeling more healthy, that's right. So that's a lot of the effects I think we're going to see long term. But overall, everything I would say to you is that I can't think of a thing we got wrong in the design. We could argue about where a tank or two goes on the rainwater side, but for the most part, I think that at this point in the game, we've really done an amazing job of doing that. And now how the work at home thing is going to play out over time, because collaboration is very important to us. I think that's going to be the big question: is how we handle that.
I would think the context of where the building is does allow people to live closer to the building, though.
Well, that's our goal, right?
Yeah.
So we want, we're trying to create a place where people want to come to work. We don't want to make their bedroom their workplace. We want to give people the flexibility, but at the same time, how do you encourage collaboration in a productive manner, not necessarily just more water cooler talk, right?
Okay.
So, but it's turned out really well in that regard. And again, we've only been in the building about 1 year and 3 months, so it's quite early. And the building is only about 70% occupied, so we've got some space there. But most days you see a pretty active crew. The one thing that we probably didn't anticipate, Don, is that we decided not to build a full kitchen in the building and we wanted to open up to local restaurants to basically come in and do the equivalent of food pop-up trucks in there to arrange for a variety of different food sources. And it was always designed to be an augmentation to the culinary community that's around the building. And what we found is that we're getting a little bit heavier load in the building because people don't want to leave the building. So that's an interesting dynamic we're seeing.
Interesting. The other thing, too, that you touched on, the solar array, which is obvious. I think what people don't understand is the rainwater collection and the extent to which we have rainwater collection there, and the geothermal, which, again, is another quiet gesture. Can you touch on those two?
Absolutely. So that's a 3-acre site. And again, go back into I want you to think about when you have a 3-acre site from an environmental perspective, what is the possibility and the potential to what you can harvest on 3 acres of land in central Texas, where we get 30 inches of rain per year on average, and we get about 300 sun days per year on average, and the ambient ground temperature just 10 feet below the ground is 72 degrees. And so what that potential is that it's quite a lot. So there's actually 150 geothermal energy wells below that building, drilled to the depth of about 310 feet. So basically about 20 25 yards off center each well, and 15 rows of 10 each. And that's all basically providing all of the heating for the cooling for basically both buildings. It's not just our building. It's basically, we built this project on 2 buildings. And so we have 1 mechanical room for 2 buildings. We reduced the cooling towers by doing that one alone from 6 cooling towers to 2 cooling towers. And this is where the synergies come in on the geothermal itself, is that geothermal by itself may not make sense, or rainwater may make sense by itself, or solar might make sense, but when you combine the two, you get these synergies. So before we actually entered geothermal into the equation, we were going to need, like I said, 6 cooling towers, and we were going to use 1 million more gallons of SAWS water because of the evaporative cooling effect of the towers. By introducing the geothermal, we went to 2. We have no boiler and no fossil fuels being burned in any way to produce any heat source in the building, in both buildings, and we've reduced about 1 million gallons of water from SAWS. So those are the synergistic effects of when you start to combine these technologies together. On the rainwater side, we're capturing rainwater from 80% of the surfaces on the building. So everywhere there's a surface, we're capturing. And then at the street level, we had low impact development as well to make sure that that runoff is not going onto the river. So when you look at an 80% surfaces, a 1-inch rainfall on that building with about 87,000 square feet of, you can do the math on this, 87,000 square feet of rooftops, is about 60,000 gallons of water. And we can handle about a 2-inch rainfall and capture all the rain. There's 145,000 gallons of storage in 4, 5, 6, 7, and 5, what's that, 12 tanks. We got 12 tanks. There's 5 up on the 5th floor deck. One of the architectural features you may notice is that if you look on the Avenue B side of the building, there's a vertical tank that goes up and down. That actually came out of the Pearl. It was an old tank that was actually in the basement after the brewery, after the post brewing before they actually did the bottling. So we repurposed that tank and had it architecturally designed. It stood on its side. It's a stainless steel tank. It was probably a 65-year-old tank now. We're going to make it last for another 65 to 100 years. And there's 4 underground tanks on the north end of the building and another 2 above ground tanks by the garage over there. So when you add all up, it's about 145, 150,000 gallons of water. And we have basically 2 systems there as well. We separate the rainwater is used for all non-potable purposes. We chose not to make it potable water purpose in the building, and I'll tell you why that is. In my house, I can actually have rainwater usage in potable as long as I have occupants of less than 25 people. When you go over 25, you have to become a water district. So we would have had to become our own water district. I'm not sure it was worth it to have a water district for 100,000 gallons a year. So it basically was easier just for us to buy SAWS potable water for that need. So all the rainwater is basically segmented into 2 sources, one for the irrigation, the other for the cooling towers and all the basins usage as well. We get 3 sources of water at Pearl that are recycled water. We get the rainwater, which is about 1.4 million gallons per year estimated. We get about 600,000 gallons of water off the condensate systems from all the HVAC systems. And then when we don't have enough of that water, we supplement that water with the SAWS reuse water that's coming out of the sewage effluent. So we're actually using no potable water in any of those systems. It's all reclaimed, recycled water. So the only area we're using potable water is for domestic purposes inside the building. So we reduced our water usage by about 4 million gallons per year.
Wow. Something you tapped onto, I think you sort of answered an earlier question. During this process, y'all went through a rebranding when y'all moved over here. And it almost feels like part of the ethos of the company, or mission of the company, is to communicate 21st century sustainability and technology. And that feels to have kind of seeped into the consciousness of everyone that works here or near here. And I'm curious to know how has that impacted either your client base or your employees?
Yeah, so
that
that's
conversation?
I'd say it was a lot of luck and a little bit of getting it right on that one. So the history of our credit union goes back to 1935. I'll just be really brief here. We've actually had 7 names in 87 years. want you to think about that. So I'll give you the first name in 1935. We were founded at Kelly Air Force Base to serve the civil servant workers that worked out there. The very first name of our credit union was the National Federation of Federal Employees, Local Number 28. That's right. It lasted 4 years, by the way. And then we became Federal Employees Credit Union. And then in 1949, we became GECU for most of those GECU days. It was Government Employees Credit Union. And that lasted until 1985. And in 1985, we became San Antonio Credit Union. And then by the 1990s, we were going by SACU, or as some would call us, SACU. So we were always finding ourselves behind our name a little bit. And the names, like I said, change about every 20 to 22 years in general, sometimes 4 years and sometimes a little longer. So we got to this point in by 1993, we're no longer in San Antonio, so San Antonio Credit Union wasn't working for us as we expanded nationally, and that's why we really shrunk down to an acronym. In 2008, we started to take on this name discussion, and the time wasn't quite right there, but we were actually operating under 6 different names across America, and it was just kind of basically a mess. It's kind of like my hair today, it's just kind of a mess, right? So we had to clean that up. So as we started to think about the name change, we had a couple criteria for the name. One is that we didn't want to have an acronym because acronyms are very hard to brand. They're very, very hard to, so what does SACU mean? What's RFBC, RFB, RFFB, I can't even say it correctly, but RBFCU mean? So very few names can get that kind of lift. IBM, AT&T. So we knew we had to get back to a real name that had real meaning, and it was universal. The second one was we didn't want to have any type of geographic or occupational or secular orientation on us anymore. And then thirdly, we wanted it to have real meaning and commitment to what we were actually founded to do in the 1930s, which is back to basically fundamentally helping people. So the process we got to get to the name was basically an internal process that took us about a year, a lot of internal debate, and I'll give you a couple elements about the name that are still a debate for us, but the key was when we chose that name, it felt like shoes bigger than we could live in. It's like, okay, we're going to have to grow into these shoes because we're not quite that yet. So that was what was exciting to me, is it was going to pull us forward instead of pulling us back. So the name was pulling us. The second thing that was really exciting for me is that if you go to the etymology of these words, credit is basically, and I went to parochial Catholic schools, so for those that took your Latin will know this, the etymology of credit is 13th century Latin for credere, or faith, trust, and belief in others. And then human is 11th century Latin for human, or the benevolence and well-being of others. And so when you take these two really old words that are universal in the languages, Slavic, the Romantic languages, English, Arabic, these words have fundamentally new meaning in a post-conventional way. So we now credit human basically it's faith, belief in one single human community, in humanity. And so as we laid that together, and then you saw that, if you look at our colors, it's green with a shading to blues. It was all designed to be around the environmental sensitivities and really what we need to see as a financial institution in the future, and then how can we live to that vision and that mission of serving people in a completely different paradigm in a post-conventional world. So as the building got built, you can imagine now what that stimulates. So what many of you may not know is we now have a sustainable home lending division that's nationwide, beginning to lend on all of these product lines. It would have never happened had we not built this building and changed the name. Would have never happened.
It's impressive.
So it's been fun. And by the way, the journey's just starting, so yeah.
Yeah. Well, what I've enjoyed is how this conversation has expanded to other people in the neighborhood. I mean, because of what y'all did, and Silver Ventures also engaged in this.
It's what we did.
Well, true.
Yeah.
And they were already doing it, but I think that it just expanded that whole dialogue to another level. And so it's fun to see that happen in other places in San Antonio.
Well, and what we got to do now is we got to help guys like Don and James push the envelope of this, because we don't want our building to be the end of it. We want it to be the beginning, and we would so much like someone to build one better than ours.
I always think that.
Absolutely, because I think it's just only going to tell you what's possible. And what's interesting about the building, I think most people don't know, is that every technology that's in this building, from a sustainability perspective, is a proven technology. We didn't take anything that's experimental. These are all proven technologies, and all we did was integrate them in a very creative way, along with an amazing aesthetic design, which means anyone could do, you got to have some creativity and some foresight, and you can't put the budget first, you got to put the budget second. But anyone can do this with the energy and the passion if they take it on. And I think that's what we need to do now, Don, is we've all got to inspire others to take this on, because a lot of the narrative I hear of reasons not to do it make absolutely no sense to me, and I am a banker. I want you to think about that. It makes absolutely no financial sense to me why people are building buildings the way they are without integrating these available technologies today that are getting more efficient, they're getting more cost effective, they can be done better with design functions, and there's just no reason not to do it. So what do you need to do is to help your clients see that, and obviously, you know it's possible. You were part of a
It's education. It's education, and the construction industry is traditionally does not like to change. And but I feel like San Antonio is moving quicker than I had anticipated.
Yeah, and so it's one other element of our building we go on for today is that we actually, when Don actually designed the architectural facades of the building, because we have such a super tight building envelope in that, and basically the way we handle the building envelope, it has a gel coating on the outside, and there's wool wrapped around it, and there's an insulated assembly set with thermal breaks in it that doesn't allow any heat to really transfer through. But they had to make sure that the design of the wall was perfectly designed and created before we laid the facade on it. So we actually built on the other side of the river from Pearl a mock-up to let them practice the building on it. So when they started building the full building, they actually had a lot of the practices down how to build the building. And then they had to go around and test. And remember, this building, it has all brick on it. So it had brick ties on the entire building. A brick tie is a penetration through a building envelope. So we did a 100% testing of the brick ties. We didn't sample them. Every brick tie was tested by the teams that were in charge of that element. And so as they started on one side, you can imagine the team was learning. And so the first side, the failure rate was pretty high. They had to go back and remediate. And so as they're remediating before they put the facade on it, but by the time they got around the entire building, the error rate got down to like under 5%. So it was amazing to watch these crews do this, which told me that the crews are learning how to do this, so now they need another building. They need another building. And so the point is that we actually now have the team here in town that knows how to build a building like this and can do it, and we just need to put them to work.
It's true. It's true.
So I know that we wanted to leave some time for questions for Steve, and I will introduce the question segment by saying that I was so excited to work with Steve for just this reason, is that he absorbs every bit of knowledge that he asks his experts to give him, and then reformulates it into this amazing design package, and then re-inspires people going forward. So I would say that you're certainly one of those people that we need to push further.
Quirkiness and personality. Yes.
Yeah, the quirkiness and personality is helpful. But do we have an external mic for questions? Okay, so we'll have some questions for Steve. Yes.
Hi.
I've never heard about anybody using geothermal as a resource around here. Now, maybe that's just ignorance, but you always think of geothermal in Iceland, places with hot whatevers. So how prevalent is this resource in the San Antonio or South Texas area?
Well, the prevalence of a heat sink is widespread here. So like I said earlier, you have a 72-degree heat sink below the ground, and what can you do with 72 degrees when it's 100 degrees outside? And what can you do with 72 degrees when it's 30 degrees outside? You can do a lot with that. So you don't have to do anything to create the heat sink, because basically it's been created by God and all of humanity over time. Because the heat sink is nothing more than the average ambient temperature of the year. If you take San Antonio's average ambient temperature and you put a solar heating on it, that's absorbed in the crust of the earth, all right? So now as you go further from the equator up, the nature of the heat sink changes in temperature. So further south it's warmer, and further north it's cooler. So in the wintertime, the heat sink actually is far more efficient than the cooling loads here, because we need more cooling load than heating load. As you go up into Canada, they need to design their buildings and their geothermal systems for the heating load, and they get cooling for free. So we get heating for free, and we have to pay for the cooling loads. And Oklahoma is actually where most of the modern technology was built in the 1960s and 70s for geothermal energy. The University of Oklahoma is actually it's one of the groundswell places of engineering for it. And Oklahoma is really where the temperatures are about perfectly balanced between summer and winter, and they get a perfect load on each side of the balancing. So in Texas, the challenge we've had for the longest time was that the HVAC equipment was never quite efficient enough on the cooling side, but it was quite efficient on the heating side. But that is changing now. So the coefficients for the cooling loads are getting quite easy now. And the other thing that's really important to know is that we didn't talk enough about it here, is that the most important thing to do on the buildings is the cheapest thing to do is insulation. If we just build better insulated buildings, you need less load. So the house that you heard about earlier, my house, it had 10 tons of air conditioning on it. It only needs 3 tons today. So we reduced the loads on it by 70% by getting the building envelope right. So the more we do with building envelope only further augments what can be done with the geothermal from that point forward. And so I would just say a lot of the schools are doing it now throughout Texas because they have large land swaths, and obviously the more land you have, the better off it is for loads. We're the first one to do it in a mid-rise office space in America. So yes, that's brand new. But that just proves it can be done. And there's no reason why anyone shouldn't consider geothermal, either for the residential or their building purposes.
There are a couple of local air conditioning contractors that excel at geothermal.
Just was ignorant. Of course, I live in a 1916 house
Right.
without any kind
Yes.
of anything.
I see a question. There was a hand raised way back there in the back.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
How did the building do during the winter storm? Uri. Is that what you said?
Which building, my house or the building downtown? Okay, so let me just say what's going on in our building to give you a sense of it. We never lost power, so that was number one. The building downtown, if you look at the design, it's actually built on a pedestal, which means the first floor of the office space is at the 5th level, and below it is garage. So now I want you to imagine for a second a concrete floor plate, 5 stories in the air, and below it is a garage space where the ambient temperature is in the 20s. What do you think was going on the 5th floor of that floor plate? It was cold, right? But not in our building. You know why that is? We actually have a radiant flooring system in that 5th floor to heat the thermal mass of that building up. So now we're using a ground source system to pull heat out of the ground in the middle of the winter to warm the thermal mass plate of the first floor of the building. And then the rest of the building is actually also all running on geothermal. So now what's happening is we're injecting cold air into the ground and pulling heat out of the ground, and we're using water and pumps to do that. And you're asking me how it performed in the middle of the winter. Perfectly. Not a fossil fuel was needed.
When did you open officially?
We opened January 2021.
Right before that storm.
Right before.
Yeah, so you mentioned some challenges with the Unified Development Code. How much learning are we getting in the city of San Antonio around the construction processes that you developed here to modify our UDC to make it easier and more friendly permitting-wise to do this kind of construction?
I will just say there's some opportunity there, from my perspective.
That's a good question.
You know, obviously, I think I ran into more on my house than we did on the building. I mean, Don, you don't remember anything particularly we ran into that was, you know, that I heard
No huge
problematic.
hurdles.
But I would tell you that for residential, we need to have some changes made. And I wouldn't say it's a broad list, but it's there. One item I think that's in there that's well, if it's used properly, is there's a variance allowed under low impact development that can be utilized to a certain degree on water infrastructure design, but it wasn't quite enough for some of the accessory dwelling units that actually, you know, remember we're trying to not let the water run off, and if you have a way to capture them with a roof system. You know, another area I ran into is they wanted me to take all of my irrigation pipe out of my ground that was white and put purple pipe in. And if you think through that, any water that goes through the backflow preventer is already non-potable, but it's already white pipe, so they were a little confused about that. They didn't want to have recycled rainwater going to the pool systems because they thought they needed to be potable, but if you think about what's in the pool, it's rainwater. So Yeah, lots of little, I would say nothing major, but lots of those little, interesting.
You'll notice they're all on the water side too, so.
Yeah, most of them were the water side, yeah. Couple on the solar, but for the most part, they were all water related.
So the follow-up question is, are there any organizations, either construction or architectural, that are working to introduce those kinds of changes into the UDC? Is there an active program to help modernize our building codes to be in line with some of this new technology?
None that I'm aware of.
What about Enron?
I'm sorry?
Well, it used to be the Solar Energy Research Institute, now it's the National Renewable Energy Lab.
Well, what you see happening with San Antonio is they adopt most of the code with a little bit of time delay. The plumbing code is a good example of this. So I'm not an expert in the codes, but the plumbing code that they were currently on in San Antonio, as when I did my house, was about 3 to 4 years behind, and so the international code had been updated, but they had not adopted it yet. So some of the standards that were acceptable there weren't acceptable in the current code. So some of it is time delay. I think the codes are moving, but if you ask me if locally someone's putting pressure on downtown to do that, I would say that's probably not. I don't know for sure, but I don't hear it.
Carrie, I have a question over here. Oh, I was just going to say, this is so impressive how you assembled the team and the expertise. I hate to see it just go to one building, as you were.
I agree with you.
So do you have a plan to start a course or any kind of seminars or anything that can go to different architecture departments of our different universities? Is any of that contemplated?
Well, I can just tell you that what's interesting about the building, I mean, we don't have a formal plan on this, but from the day that the building was coming out of the ground, we had students from UTSA's construction management program coming through the buildings and the professors coming through the buildings. And so most of the industry professional groups have either been in the building, have promoted the building, are planning to come in the building over the next several years. The general contractor that built the building, McDonald, obviously here, they're constantly walking through people through these buildings. So I would say that informally, the professional, the people in the construction industry know about these buildings. They absolutely do. Now, what's the broader base look like? Obviously, education such as this. Anytime we're invited to come talk about this, we typically do. It's difficult to open up our office buildings to just have general public to come walk through any time. There's been some discussion about how we can do that sometimes. But a lot of the videos, and we actually have the videos that you saw in the building, there's actually a whole site. If you go to 1703broadway.com, there's actually an entire education system out there on everything in the buildings and videos to go with it. So some of this we've tried to basically put together so the content so that anyone that becomes aware of it, if you just Google the building a little bit, there's a lot to learn about that. So I think there's more that we can do on that. One of the challenges I have is that I'm the only one that's been giving tours lately, and I'm getting a little tired of giving tours, and we need to give that away. But most of the city council members have been through the building. The city manager has not been there yet. He's under a lot of pressure to come, for those that want to know that, for reasons you can imagine. And there's a lot of support downtown for what we've done there. We've had great partnerships with SAWS, CPS, SARA, the Water, Sanitary River Authority, on these buildings. So I don't see how that we're going to put that genie back in the bottle. It's just how do we want to curate this and educate going forward is the opportunity. And people like Don and James, they're out there. So I defer to them on what they have to say about it, because this is the work they're doing and they're talking about it. So what do you guys think? I mean, you guys are this is what's going on now.
No, it's a valid point. I think the AIA could make the Association of Architects could make a stronger stance on that. But I think we do. I think it's just to your point, within the construction community, within the architecture community, there's a lot of noise, but it's hard to communicate that to people just out there building something.
That's my point, is that if you could get it
Exactly.
more widespread, at least with the awareness, and not require that everybody have to go through that building. If you can do some kind of outreach that makes it available to others who may not be located nearby, I think that would be very valuable.
It's a good point.
This is for Don. In our pre-conference interview, you mentioned the old technology of Heinrich Portschiller and the buildings in Roma and Rio Grande City. So can you tell us a little bit more about that inspiration? You were talking about brick buildings 300 years old and how that works.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I think we talk about the longevity of buildings and imbuing them with meaning to create a longer lifespan. And so we always look at several things when we build a new building. We talked about one earlier, just the context and the fact that we have brick and limestone locally. One of the other resources, though, is the cultural resources. And so we're researching the architects that have been here before us. We feel like there is a unique local San Antonio architecture. I don't think you can go to Austin or Houston and say that looks and feels like that city, but in San Antonio, we feel like we've got an architectural tradition that we can build on. We feel like there's a local architecture that's continuing to emerge. And so Heinrich Portscheller is one of the architects that we look to. He was I don't know, for people that don't know, he did these incredible buildings along the Rio Grande River in Roma and in Rio Grande City, and they've stood the test of time. They were mostly mid to late 19th century, and to this day they look like they could have been built yesterday. So when we started looking at brick construction in San Antonio, we felt like these structures felt so much like South Texas. And so he was one of the architects we referred to. Another one was Johann Fries. Not many people know him, but he's the one that opened the quarry, which is now the Japanese Sunken Gardens. And he did the little pediment on the Alamo. He built the Mangra Hotel. He did beautiful limestone buildings here in San Antonio. So we tapped into that vocabulary. Fort Sam Houston, done by Alfred Giles, just up the hill. You know, these are all buildings in our neighborhood. So in order to build a building, design a building that would stand the test of time, we look to all these kind of cultural resources. And the other one that Steve talked about was the craftsmen. There were so many craftsmen on this building, and these were people they didn't live in the immediate vicinity, and a lot of them did. They lived in South Texas, and these are people like a guy named Abel who is continuing the Isaac Maxwell tinsmith tradition, and all of the lighting on the arcade at Credit Human was done by these guys. Again, just a local San Antonio craft that builds on that local tradition. We had 3 or 4 different ceramicists. We had 2 different, I guess, iron workers and 1 stone carver. And so these are all people that built this building at this particular moment in time that we feel like for 100 years people come back and touch and look at. I can't say enough about the masons either. I mean, obviously there's a lot of masonry in this building, and these guys really rose to the occasion and took a lot of pride in it. You'd come here in the late afternoon, they'd have their families out looking at what they'd done. And so we really think that this engagement with the community is part of building a sustainable building. And so that's where that comes from.
Given the fact that you have all these historic buildings in San Antonio that are already existing from these iconic architects, to what extent could you take the technology that you've used there in the Credit Human building and retrofit those buildings so that we're not just talking about that technology for new construction, but yet actually retrofitting some of the historic architecture?
Well, it's funny you asked that, because we're actually looking at our old building on 6061810 that we built in 1976 to see if we can do that very thing right now. So we've gone through the building forensically over the past several months. We're going to actually drill a test geothermal energy well over the next month or 2. But we actually think we can transform that building. So stay tuned is what I would say to you. Because I agree with you, that's going to be the big challenge in America. It's not the new buildings we're building, it's the transformation of the existing buildings. And that's the harder job.
Other questions? Oh, sorry.
Has the change in plans on Broadway in front of your building going to affect your building at all?
Let me just repeat it for everybody. She asked if the other buildings going up on Broadway.
No, the change in plans.
Oh, the change in plans for Broadway.
Well, we actually are the first building to take advantage of that lane. So we've actually done it already. You know, my sense is that
you know, I'm not really politically astute enough to know how the governor's going to handle this, but I think he's going to get himself in a pickle if he tries to start taking this back. Given that we've put the first major project down on the ground that is envisioning where it's going, I don't see them cutting our building up. I mean, they'd have to basically take out part of our plaza, and I don't think you know, we're not worried about it if that's, but it would be a tragic thing because the design for Broadway was one of the reasons we decided to move there. Is you know, all the reasons that you know, yeah. So we're not worried, but you never know with politics.
Like in San Antonio and other cities, strip centers and convenience stores and other marginal buildings. Can you apply any of these your building features to future? You know, they build them. I don't know what they build. How many years they build a convenience store for, but it's probably not all that long. Same thing on strip centers. That's the ugly part of most cities. Is there anything you can do about that, making them sustainable and a desirable buildings?
Well, you know, I'm not an architectural. That's not what I do, and my general sense is that a lot of these buildings that have been built aren't going to last that long to begin with, and so the older buildings that are in blight, you know, a lot of those buildings have really good bones in them. So if we can get back to the bones of the building, there's probably a lot that can be done. But a lot of the, you know, and I'm of the opinion that a lot of buildings that were built probably since the 1980s through about 2010, 2015, many of them, and again, this is my personal opinion, they just aren't as high quality as the older buildings are built. So there's probably an era of buildings in here that we're just going to have to look back in time and say that was a nice experiment. We probably need to get back to some more quality long-term building approaches to the building. I mean, a lot of these, you know, these residential centers, they're just tilt wall. I mean, it's a simple construction. It works, but there's not much you can do with a tilt wall in many regards. I mean, yeah, we could put a little more insulation in them. We could probably put some solar panels on them. But for the most part, I think that those buildings are going to really require, kind of a creative thinking to repurpose them to begin with. I mean, I know what one thing we're going through as a financial institution is that the branch banks that you know today are all going to die economically. They're not going to die because the buildings are bad, but the buildings themselves are no longer going to be used for the initial purposes because technology has completely changed the way we interact with our financial institutions. So we envision a lot of our old branches are going to have to be fundamentally repurposed in general, and I think that gives a real opportunity to, in the repurposing, how do you want to redesign those? How do you want to install sustainability on them? Every one of the buildings we're involved in, we have solar on them today. We've looked at it, can we actually add more to it? And in fact, we've got a lady here that's working with us today, Beth. One of her jobs is going to be to think through those existing buildings, how she can actually apply a portfolio approach to those buildings to see what we can do with them. So,
a quick question, just it's great what you're doing in the environmental aspects of this building and so forth. Are there other regional or national projects of the same caliber that we should know about that you're aware of?
well, the only one we're working on now that is of this significance is our old building our old headquarter building on I-10 that we're just in the research and discovery phase now. And my goal is, and again, I got to be careful. My staff may jump down my throat for saying this, but my goal is we're going to make that building as unique and as sustainable as the one we have down on Broadway.
Oh, that's great. But are there other companies that you architects, or are you aware of any others around the country that are doing similar to what Credit Human just did?
It's happening all over the country. I mean, it's encouraging what's going on right now.
Okay, good to hear that. The other question was, how are you navigating the at-home and on to the office challenges, with your workforce? Are you all 100% online, or at the office, or at home too, or how are you doing that?
We've declared that we're not a work-at-home company. So we declared that a year and a half ago to just take some of the confusion out. I think what you're going to see us do is, and let me just give you my broader perspective on this. I actually think the American culture is moving more toward the European culture when it comes to work over the next, and it's going to continue to occur for probably a couple of decades. And to put that in perspective, the Germans work about 1,400 hours per year, and Americans work around 1,800, 1,850 hours per year. So as a society, we're going to have to find ways for the work quality balances that people want and their flexibility. How do you actually work fewer hours and maintain the productivity? And as a country, we're not quite there yet. So what you see us as a culture doing is
one, our management systems aren't designed that way. Most managers are designed to manage people they can see and they can talk to. They're not designed to manage someone they can't see and they're going to have to reach out to some other way. So imagine all the management systems of our organizations are going to have to change that way. And so the challenge I see is that we can grow to the degree we can basically get our management systems to evolve and adapt as quickly as possible. You're going to see more of that flexibility coming in. There's always going to be the need for the office. I mean, that's really where, imagine a new kid coming out of college right now. How do they assimilate themselves to a culture? They've just dropped in their dorm room and given a laptop computer and say, welcome to the company. That's not how people learn. People learn by seeing and by interacting and by mentoring. So we've got to find ways to get a lot more effective at that. We have some remnants of that in our organization today, but it's still early. But I think over time you're going to see us get much better at that. And organizations are going to be forced to do that. So I think that we're probably a good company to keep an eye on and how we handle that, because we actually do believe in the humanity of our people and how their work life is. And yes, we still have a defined pension plan for them, and they have a great health care plan. They have time off, but we're also a nonprofit. We're not a for-profit bank, so make it as a nonprofit credit union. We have a lot more flexibility. So I think you're going to see society in America really struggle with this question for the next couple of years, and ultimately it's going to resolve itself toward the European standard.
Okay, I think we got one more. We got time for one more.
You mentioned a .com that we can go, because my husband's going to ask me a million questions when I get home that I can't answer. What is that .com that you mentioned that we can go look? 1703 Broadway.com.
All right. Thank y'all so much for your time. We certainly appreciate it. It's very interesting and educational, and we will share your story with our community as well. So let's give our speakers a round of applause, if you would.
Thanks for your interest.